Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Berkeley Forum. We are excited to be hosting our second event of this semester. By way of introduction, my name is Cindy Tang, and I am the current president of the Berkeley Forum. And tonight, we are excited to be welcoming Ken Klippenstein to speak. To start, we have two quick forms that we'd like to ask for you to fill out if you're willing and able. But first, we have an attendance form just to keep track of metrics for the event. And two, we have a questions form if you would like to submit any audience Q&A for Ken to answer at the end of the event. Please feel free to fill out both forms as you are available, and they will also be posted in the live stream. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to tonight's event manager, Aaliyah Bihimino, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Cindy, so much for the warm welcome, as well as to Ken for joining us today. So I've had the pleasure of working with Ken to help plan this event and in introducing him to you all today. So Ken Klippenstein is an investigative reporter for The Nation, whose work focuses on the machinations of the national security state. In recent years, he's reported on federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies, including ICE, Customs and Border Protection, the Defense Department, and the FBI. His work draws heavily on primary source documents obtained via both inside sources and the Freedom of Information Act, which he'll be discussing today. He is based in Washington, D.C.
Hey, everyone. This is Ken Klippenstein. I'm the DC correspondent for The Nation. Thanks for bearing with me there. I'm going to be talking to you guys right now about the reporting I've been doing over the last couple of years, covering the Department of Homeland Security, immigration, which of course, under this administration, there have been very dramatic changes to our immigration policy. And I don't think that there is any agency that we see that through more clearly than Department of Homeland Security. So a theme that I'm going to be talking about will be what we do to ourselves. What we do to others, we also end up doing to ourselves in many ways. I think we're seeing that clearly with COVID, which is, a disease that it's very hard to, not have a kind of global view about. It's, something that you can't isolate to just one country. It spreads very quickly. And in much the same fashion, we've talked about interconnectedness a lot, being in the global era that we are. But in immigration, there's often this attitude that what we do to migrants is something isolated to our treatment of migrants, but in many ways we're seeing that treatment be extended to US citizens now. So I think the most dramatic illustration of that is what happened in Portland when the Trump administration deployed Border Patrol officers there to respond to what the administration claimed was civil unrest. There's a lot of debate about that, and I'll talk about that in just a few moments. But what I wanted to start out with was just run you guys down some of the pretty unique policy characteristics of the Trump administration with respect to immigration. And it's not just the deportations. I want to stress that first and foremost. That's of course what gets perhaps the most coverage when we're seeing folks put into paddy wagons and sent back to their respective countries. But that's not something that happens instantaneously. They're put into detention facilities that themselves have horrendous conditions. There have been a number of whistleblowers that have stepped forward from within ICE to disclose to me, as well as Congress and other reporters, these conditions that again, what we do to others, we end up doing to ourselves. The conditions in these ICE detention facilities are a tinderbox now because of the pandemic that we're experiencing. The crowded conditions that we're seeing there, the unsanitary conditions that have existed for years and years, it's now coming back to hurt us, the members of the general public, citizens that perhaps may not be, have much cause for interaction with ICE. Now, if the disease is spreading in these very unsanitary and close conditions within ICE facilities, that affects the rest of us. There's one example of many that I'm going to provide you guys with during the course of this talk. But another one of the policies is family separation. We have changes to the asylum system. This administration is very clear that they want to make it so that when a migrant wants to come and claim or have considered their claim of political asylum, which is under international law, is something that any state is supposed to at least consider. We say, what are the conditions that they're suffering from? Is that something that they can reasonably claim that they need to flee from violence, and we can give them some kind of safe haven here? These are all things that the Trump administration has changed in the course of its approach to immigration policy. And so, again, I mentioned DHS is one prism to look at those changes through. And so I'll talk about that for a moment now. Department of Homeland Security is a post 9/11 agency. Many of us listening to this now are actually older than the Department of Homeland Security. It is the largest law enforcement body in the country. DHS actually sought to join the IC, but was rebuffed for a number of reasons. I'm sorry, I need to get some water. My throat is parched just a moment. Excuse me, thank you for waiting. So what's interesting about the Department of Homeland Security, this is a huge agency, the largest law enforcement body in the entire country. It's not often understood that that's the case, but it's bigger than any of the other law enforcement agencies we have at either the local or federal level. It's got an enormous budget. If you want to look at the staff, it's got 45,000 Border Patrol and CBP officers. That's 3 times the number of armed FBI. It's got 20,000 ICE law enforcement personnel. That's bigger than FBI, ATF, and DEA combined. So this is a huge agency, and we're just now seeing not just what it can do, because the force of its resources have been brought to bear against immigrants for a long time now, but we're seeing what it can do to U.S. citizens now. So I mentioned before Portland. That is a great example of how things come home, how what we do to others, we do to ourselves, and the way in which we've deployed Border Patrol and really beefed them up and beefed up the southern border. Border Patrol were the units that DHS deployed to Portland. A lot of people were surprised by that. They said, what does Border Patrol have to do with potential civil unrest? The administration says that this was a case of rioters that needed to be put down and in order to keep the public safe. I'm not disputing that there were instances of property destruction, but these are pretty limited to bring something like a federal agency to bear against. What's interesting about their use of Border Patrol is that it's actually legal, and to me that is the scandal here, is that a lot of what the Trump administration does, there's actually some sort of legal basis for, because Border Patrol is able to operate within 100 miles of any U.S. external border. And so Portland would have been contained within that. And so, Americans now are seeing what happens when you use the resources of, again, this huge agency with all this money, personnel, resources internally against U.S. citizens, not just against migrants. What's interesting about the types of units that the Trump administration deployed to Portland, they're called BORTAC, that stands for Border Patrol Tactical Units. This is sort of like their equivalent of the SWAT team, very elite force to bring to bear against what is essentially they're broken windows. There's some property destruction at the local level, but nothing I don't think that local law enforcement couldn't handle. But when what you got is a hammer, a sledgehammer in this case, everything ends up looking like a nail. And so, the president has this huge agency with a ton of resources that local law enforcement don't have. I don't think it's a huge surprise that he's going to use it in such a fashion that I think the reporting suggests, it was supposed to be a sort of fireworks show, a kind of optics thing for, we're in election year now. So let's look at what he brought to bear against these protesters. He not just Border Patrol tactical units, he also sent in marshals. That's part of the Justice Department, very highly trained force that are usually used to defend federal property like courts and things like that. What's interesting about this is that not only were they deploying things like tear gas, arresting, kettling people, in some cases, pulling people off the streets without what appeared to be any sort of evidence of a crime. But again, these are, federal forces. And so when, the public, people of Portland want to know what's going on, they can't go to their, local, they can't go to their council members or mayor and say, tell us what this is, because this is federal. This is being run out of Washington. But again, Department of Homeland Security being a post 9/11 agency, they've given an enormous amount of latitude to be able to operate on a local level. The arguments originally for the Department of Homeland Security were that it would be able to help local law enforcement and share intelligence with them. Remember, one of the problems, one of the reasons 9/11 happened is because there wasn't sufficient intelligence sharing between bodies like the FBI, the CIA, and so forth. So, I mean, that's the rationale behind it. But in effect, they're able to deputize their federal officers to basically act as cops, and that's what we saw there. And some of the problems with DHS doing that is that their hiring and training requirements are far lower than other federal counterparts. So, for example, if you compare, say, the FBI with the Department of Homeland Security, FBI is going to have a lot more training. They're going to have a lot more experience. Not just that, they're much less political. DHS, again, being a post 9/11 agency, was designed to be more responsive to the president than components of the Justice Department were. So to give you guys a couple of examples, Customs and Border Patrol, ICE, they both have unions that have endorsed Trump. If you look at the FBI, they don't even have a union, much less any sort of, they have a sort of trade group, an association that they're part of, but they haven't endorsed Trump. And that's just, I think, one good illustration of the difference between them in terms of how politicized they are. So you have these highly politicized agencies that are being used for things consistent with, the president's messaging around this kind of stuff. He's said repeatedly, these Democrat cities are out of control and we need to, bring them to heel. And so DHS is just the perfect tool for him to reach for in his toolbox. As you recall, he spent some time saying he wanted to send active duty military out to respond to the protests. And he wasn't able to do that because the military is just not designed to be responsive to the president in the way that the Department of Homeland Security is. So again, we are seeing illustrated what DHS had done at the border in many cases, now being done perhaps within 100 miles of a border, but not within something that we think of as like a area where migrants are coming in through. So to give you guys a few more examples, to give you guys a sense of the sort of flavor of the Department of Homeland Security that has really made it sort of shocking and interesting for me to cover. And I think something that the public should be debating about right now is that it has a really unclear mission. The Department of Homeland Security contains all sorts of different sub-agencies within it, from the TSA, Transportation Security Administration. They have the Coast Guard, they've got ICE, they have Customs and Border Protection. They have all sorts of different things. And that just creates a lack of sort of internal cohesion and agreement about what the mission is. And when you have a lack of a mission like that, you've got an agency that is something that can be manipulated really easily by, in this case, the White House. And you have an internal culture of far more corruption than any other federal law enforcement agency. So to give you guys an example, between 2005 and 2012, there was almost one Border Patrol agent or officer arrested every single day, to give you guys a sense of the degree of sort of disorganization and frankly corruption that's going on here. They have an extremely high number of political appointees compared to other federal agencies. So all of this, I think, creates a culture in which someone like President Trump can step in and use this agency to an effect that a very political effect. One that in an election year like this can be something that he can use to message to his base to try to get them to turn out for him. Looking at my notes here. So what's interesting about the law that they used to deploy these federal units, these federal assets to Portland, it's called 40 U.S. Code 1315. And this was actually, again, like DHS, passed right after 9/11. This passed with the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And that allows them to deputize these guys as local law enforcement. So I want to stress to everyone watching how much this is a consequence of the sort of mood right after 9/11, which was fear and anxiety and paranoia, which, I'm sympathetic to. I can understand. It was a confusing and scary time. The U.S. had not been attacked like that, perhaps ever. Maybe, if you want to go as far back as Pearl Harbor. So that paranoia is the sort of conditions that they say, okay, well, we need to give them special powers to be able to respond to this. And one of those special powers was the ability to respond to things quickly and on a local level. But as you can see, that can be used to political effect. It's not just, there was this presumption that no White House would exploit that and be able to use it for their own political aims. But as we've seen with this, it's so clearly an attempt by this administration to, at least in part, be able to signal to a certain constituency among them that has very strong views about, law enforcement's role in responding to protest. And so the executive order, I want to read you guys the title of that. It's quite sort of amusing. It's Protecting American Monuments, Memorials, Statues, and Combating Recent Criminal Activity. That executive order is what they use to sort of activate DHS and be able to deploy them to these places, because you're thinking, what is he defending here? That's federal property. It's, Portland, there's going to be limited federal property. Their argument is that, the deployments were in a certain radius of federal courthouse, and they're always going to be able to find some sort of federal property that they, are going to say that they need to defend. And this is just one example. I want to stress that, Portland is one discrete case, but that can happen anywhere. He has the power to, deploy these assets anywhere within 100 miles of a border. And that, I think, illustrates better than anything what we're dealing with here with this agency. Because previous administrations, have been fairly limited in their use of the agency and the agency's resources. And this administration is really showing you how much farther they can go. Over the course of my reporting, I have found attempts by this agency to really sort of put itself in the position to be sort of shadow Defense Department. They've pursued increasing secrecy. Both the Customs and Border Protection as well as ICE has acquired a special security designation that allows them to enjoy greater secrecy in all sorts of ways, from concealing from public disclosure information about their personnel, information about their salaries, their working titles, like what exactly they're up to. And I mean, all of this suggests to me that this agency that has become something that gets more and more funding, more and more resources, more and more personnel, also more and more secrecy. It's almost like it's trying to replace agencies that we already have that have a lot of those characteristics that I think should, like the FBI or the CIA or a lot of these intelligence bodies that we do give those sorts of secrecy to, because in many regards that's necessary. But there needs to be a public debate about if it's necessary with this agency, because it's a much different one, and it can be wielded in ways that I think are surprising and frankly shocking to people that care about the sort of norms and trappings of a free society that we have. So I really appreciate your guys tuning in and giving me your time to talk about this agency that gets coverage, but I don't think with the proper kind of historical context. When you think DHS, you should think 9/11, because that's really the environment in which we gave it the power and the character and the resources that it has. So thanks so much for joining me, guys. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and say hello in the comments. Goodbye, all.
Thank you so much, Ken. So now we're going to transition into the moderated Q&A portion. So I'd like to invite our moderator for the evening, Aparna Iyer, to our virtual stage to continue with Q&A.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks so much for that transition. We're super excited to have Ken here and an amazing audience in this virtual setting. Just to check in really quickly with a few housekeeping needs. If you are an audience member, please make sure to fill out the attendance form so we can keep track of that. And if you have any questions, you can submit them to the audience question form, and I will be reading them out for Ken to hear. So Ken, if you want to hop back on, we can move into the moderated portion.
There we go. I can hear something.
Yes, can you hear? Great, okay, perfect. Sorry about the difficulties, but we can go ahead and get started. So you mentioned during your talk, and you've previously spoken about how intelligence is often only released by political actors when it furthers an agenda. So how, if at all, can such politicization be mitigated, especially as it relates to access by the public, given these barriers to entry?
Yeah, I think that what needs to happen generally with respect to media and specific to this is there needs to be more public literacy around these things. I don't know if that needs to be part of a sort of educational curriculum. I think that we're seeing, the rise of the discussion of fake news, which is also an issue is the real problem here is that people don't have this sort of either resources or ability to be able to vet claims and know where it's coming from, what are the interests of the outlet propagating this.
Actually, sorry, Ken, really quickly, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think your microphone might be cutting out just a little bit. Do you want to try reconnecting or maybe disconnecting them altogether?
Yeah, I can just.
Sure. One more time.
Is this better?
Yes, much better. Yeah, carry on. Sorry about that.
Yeah. I think there needs to be more literacy around media and around the fact that different media outlets are going to be coming from, different angles. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily getting money from political parties or anything like that. But when you get a piece of news from the Fox News or the New York Times or the Washington Post, they will have different, a sort of different bent. And I don't even necessarily mean politically. Like as a reporter, you become reliant on the sources that tend to give you information. And I don't know how to impress that upon the public, but there needs to be literacy around this. When you see a piece of information, it should be understood that there are relationships that the press cultivates, with sources, and that is going to color what kinds of things they're released and the way that they talk about it. And I think a lot of this could be dealt with by just a discussion about the economy of the media and how the media functions, what its interests are, and that's going to vary from outlet to outlet. So I'm sure it's not easy, but it's something that I do think needs to happen, and really just a lot of healthy skepticism about what folks are seeing.
And now some have argued that the internet has devalued the role of the press through an oversaturation of information. So how, if at all, do you think the current state of the internet affects the credibility of the press, especially in your experience?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But the information, a lot of it is superficial. There is there's a whole cottage industry of like rewriting news that is put out by places like the New York Times or the Associated Press, things that are called wire services that themselves do, good in original reporting. But then there's a whole lot of websites that are essentially just rewriting those releases for their respective audiences and to kind of match up with the sort of political or aesthetic preferences of those respective audiences. So you're right that we're exposed to more information than ever, but a lot of the information is superficial and it's sort of echoing and repeating itself. So I wish and I hope that there will be a sort of backlash against that and more focus on original reporting as opposed to the sort of rehashed commentary that we see again and again from so many different outlets. So, while there's certainly more of it than ever, I think there's also more superficial coverage than there's ever been.
One of your primary sources, especially for figuring out more information for your reporting, is through the Freedom of Information Act. Now, regarding especially what you were talking about during your address, you've written about how Immigration and Customs Enforcement has been classified as a security agency by the current administration, placing limits on the disclosure of information about employee conduct. What, if any, do you think are the larger impacts of this move on the ability of the public to access information about ICE through the Freedom of Information Act?
It hinders their abilities. I myself have shifted a lot more towards working with sources who themselves are essentially leaking to me primary source documents because this particular agency, Department of Homeland Security, has made it so hard to find these things out through the proper channels. And that's another thing that I'd like to see sort of public debate about, because there's enormous consternation and frankly rage on the part of policymakers in Washington, what the White House officials at the concept of leaking. They're always like, oh, you're not authorized to hand these things out. Why are you giving this? Well, the extent to which leaking is useful is also, it reflects the extent to which the formal channels have failed, and that is the Freedom of Information Act, open records requests. These are supposed to be the ways that not just reporters, but ordinary members of the public can go and find out what the government is up to, what they're doing with our, tax dollars in our name and, to us on our own soil. And, when they make that difficult, or as you pointed out, when they get these security designations that in many cases make it impossible for the public to be able to find out, there's not much more, there aren't many more avenues for people to find out what's going on than whistleblowers who, disclose things to reporters like myself. So unfortunately, that's the direction things have gone. These things can be changed. These security designations they didn't have recently. Folks in Congress I know that I've spoken to seem unhappy about the direction which is going. So we can just either go back to the previous state of affairs or ideally, enhance the transparency. But you're absolutely right. The steps are towards secrecy, not towards disclosure and transparency, and that's going to lead to more leaking, and it's also going to lead to less openness and knowledge on the part of the public about what the heck these guys are doing.
So in terms of that relationship, in a recent tweet, you argued that government agencies can exploit loopholes to withhold information despite Freedom of Information Act regulations. So, what reforms to the Act, if any, do you see as being necessary to further investigative journalism in the future?
I think that there's going to have to be an interrogation again of, absent policy changes that can compel these agencies to disclose things. There's no reason Congress can't just say DHS, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, you're required to do a quarterly disclosure of, let's say, the conditions inside of ICE detention facilities, or you're required to disclose how many, where did you send Customs and Border Protection drones and for how long and for what reason. Congress can make them do these things. For whatever reason, Congress has not done that, but that is something that they can do. But absent that policy change, we're going to have a culture change in terms of how people think about, the advisability of leaking, because that, again, under these conditions, that's the only way that we're able to find a lot of this stuff out. And there is an attitude of, anger and real lack of protection for whistleblowers who disclose things. And so if we can enhance those protections, that's another way that we could try to, that I think would promote the kind of sharing of information the public needs to know that they're having withheld from them. So there are, different approaches, either via Congress or just, cultural changes. But I agree with you, something needs to change here to find out so that we can have the information we need.
Through the lens of journalism, like you were talking about, it was reported in March that the capacity of the federal government to process FOIA requests has been severely reduced due to COVID-19 precautions. So what, if any, has been the broader impact of the pandemic on journalists' ability to access necessary documents and cover government accountability?
Oh, it's been disastrous. I think that when you have these situations where, clearly COVID is an unusual situation, and I understand, things are not going to operate as smoothly as they have been. As I said before, they have had no problem deploying federal assets to, respond to protesters and things like that. The problems seem to crop up around stuff that they don't like to do. I'm not saying that, FOIA isn't necessarily going to be hampered by something like that, but it seems interesting to me and sort of selective, the ways in which the government has, slowed down its processes versus other ones that they've been very zealous and rapid in terms of their response to. So my fear is that, in conditions like these, in emergency sort of situations, the government is going to take advantage of the latitude the public gives them. Some reasonable, I'm not saying that things all need to be exactly the same, but the first things to get shut down are often things like open records and stuff that, benefits the public. And I would like to know, why they can surge Border Patrol out to Portland and, have drones over Minneapolis in response to protests there, but they can't respond to, basic FOIA requests. It seems like a disjunct if ever I saw one.
Now, you talked specifically about, Custom and Border Protection's, response to police brutality. And your article in July actually elaborated on CBP's response to Senator Harris's inquiry about the controversial federal response to protests against police brutality. So what responsibility, if any, does the federal government have in disclosing enforcement activities specifically to the public?
Well, again, the types of information they're required to disclose are largely mandated by Congress. And there are some things that they've had to disclose, and credit where credit's due, Congress has stood up to them now more than ever. I think because of how far this administration is exploiting and pushing DHS to do its bidding, they have been required to answer questions. But what I'm finding from my sources inside DHS is that they're doing what they can to try to circumvent these requests and kind of minimize how much information they end up disclosing to them. I sort of allude to this in the article. I'm going to have another article about this at some point. But they're literally, talking amongst themselves saying, I'd rather not disclose this stuff about the drones that we're using, which, by the way, DHS has drones. It's something people are often surprised by. They say, the senator didn't technically ask for exactly this, so we don't have to give it to him. And what's unfair about that is, okay, maybe she didn't technically ask for it. In a good faith kind of interaction between an agency and Congress, they go back to Congress and say, you were unclear on this. Do you want this thing or not? And they don't do that. They just handle it internally, and they kind of unilaterally decide, no, we're not going to give that to her. That's not how these agencies, Congress is supposed to exercise oversight. They can't do that if these agencies are, acting in secret and deciding what sorts of things are disclosed unilaterally. So on the one hand, Congress needs to, mandate that they disclose more information. But on the other, this agency needs to start behaving in a more good faith manner than it has been.
On this note again of, unilateral disclosure, something that's been on everyone's mind is related to COVID-19. So what have been the long-term consequences of withholding public health information related to the pandemic?
Under pandemic law, another sort of interesting thing, because a lot of that was created by a series of executive orders under the Bush administration right after 9/11 that really updated and created a lot of the substance of pandemic law that we have now. It treats it as a national security crisis, which I'm not saying it's not, but they end up giving a lot of these federal agencies the same sorts of power that you would think of when there's a terror attack or some kind of international event, maybe a war or something like that. One of the things that they enjoy then is not just more power, but more secrecy. Anytime that you have something that's relevant to national security and there's a perceived threat, there's going to be a tendency on the part of the agencies to move towards increased, not just freedom of sort of motion in terms of what sorts of operations they're able to conduct, but also secrecy. And so that is exact. And, we've seen the Trump administration, the White House, try to actually classify a lot of the information about the COVID response. And, from folks I've talked to, I say, is this reasonable? They said, no, this is what you do if you don't want it to come out. Because once you classify something, there are serious criminal penalties for disclosing them. That's what you do when you want to hide things. And I'm not saying that there aren't things that should be secret. I don't want the nuclear codes out there. I'm sure most folks don't. But there's a lot of stuff that they claim the public shouldn't know, that they have a political interest to do so that is expedient to them and is not in the national interest or in the public interest. So that is something that you've seen abused more and more under the conditions of the pandemic. And which again, part of the controversy here is that it's legal for them to do so because they've been given such broad latitude under those executive orders after 9/11 that were never turned back.
You mentioned the relationship between legality and the actual actions being conducted by federal actors. So though many government and financial documents have been uncovered in the past decade, from the WikiLeaks to the Panama Papers to your own recent work, arguably little has been done in regard to the leaks. So what are your views on how the public and the government have responded to disclosures which implicate wrongdoing?
Well, as a reporter, what I found is that getting stuff out to the public is only part of, if the goal is to have some kind of response on the part of policymakers, that's really only the first step. What you have to see is Congress respond to that and formalize some kind of response in terms of policy. And on the part of the public, there needs to be, I think, more literacy around how exactly you pressure Congress to do that. So I think, as you say, there's probably more kind of, what would you call it, mass leaks than ever. I mean, you mentioned WikiLeaks, Panama Papers. There's something called Blue Leaks, which was a whole bunch of Homeland Security intelligence that got leaked. And so it ends up creating a lot of news and a lot of outrage and a lot of furor, but it doesn't often lead to sort of policy changes. And so I don't think it's that the public is necessarily checked out. People seem enraged by these things, but there needs to be some kind of concerted and organized response to them in order to exert the kinds of pressure that is going to spur Congress to action. I know a lot of congressional staffers as part of my job, and they'll tell you that if people are organized under formal, lobbying institution, something like the Sunrise Movement, for instance. Their work has been very effective at advancing the kind of generalized concern people have about climate change, but using that concern to pressure politicians to do something about it. And so I think there needs to be more of that organization in order to put pressure. And what I was trying to say before about congressional staffers, when that pressure is organized and sort of concerted, they really feel the heat, and they get nervous, Congress. And they really don't like to see when people get together in a sort of coherent fashion and leverage their demands against them in a way that the public can see. Because then the ball's in their court, and the public says, wait, they're articulating this demand. Why isn't Congress doing something about it? So if they can organize better, then I think that you'll see more of a response. I think that's why you have it, is because a lot of the response to these stories has been kind of dissolute and disorganized and decentralized.
Unfortunately, for the sake of time, this is going to be my last question before we move on to questions from the audience. And so regarding your journalistic method overall, you're quite an avid Twitter user with more than 28,000 tweets. How, if at all, do your interactions with American politicians and controversial figures on this platform shape your more serious or evidence-backed investigations?
Yeah, I try to have a firewall between the two because I don't think there's a problem with having views. I guess I'm, perhaps different from some older reporters who will tell you something different. My view is every reporter has thoughts and views. Why pretend otherwise? I think the problem is when those, that kind of opinion sort of creeps into the, fact-based and objective reporting that you're supposed to try to aspire to. So yeah, you'll find my takes on Twitter, you'll find my feuds, things like that. But I've often found that if you're able to segregate that from the reporting itself, people know and are able to differentiate between the two. They know that a news article in a sort of formal setting and in the format of, I've sought out comment from others, give them a chance to respond to allegations that either I found or, I'm quoting from others, they're going to treat that differently than a one-off tweet. But at the same time, I've had a lot of sources reach out to me on account of not just my, Twitter presence, but other social media. So this has created an enormous tool and an asymmetric one at that for, folks that are not in the traditional media and don't have the resources or the Rolodex of the New York Times to be able to find other people who themselves work at these agencies, and maybe they don't have the means to find some other Times and be able to reach out to them. So it's been really, there are problems. It's a double-edged sword, but there's a lot of upside to this new, kind of social media-driven media ecosystem that we have now, I think.
Thanks so much for answering our questions, and I'll now move on to questions from the audience. And so we have a good number of those, so I'll just jump right in, and thank you to any audience members who submitted your names. So the first question comes from Denton, who asks, what advice do you have for young people who are aspiring FOIA troublemakers? How can we navigate a system that is designed to be cumbersome and inaccessible?
I would say start out by using form letters. If you just type into Google FOIA, FOIA, and then whatever the state is, Alabama, Massachusetts, whatever, they will give you a generic letter that you can use that'll have kind of empty portions that you fill out according to your request. That makes it really easy for you to ask for things like fee waivers, expedited processing. It fills in a lot of the difficulties in, there's federal FOIA, which, is just called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, but every state has its own interpretation of that as well. And so if you're asking for a local record, you don't actually use FOIA, you use, California Sunshine Act, or, whatever the relevant state is. And so, just type in the state FOIA. That'll provide you with the generic thing that's a great starting point. Also use Muckrock, and you can view on muckrock.com other requests that people have put out, and it also shows you the disposition of them. That's a great way to find out what requests tend to work, which don't. You can also look at FOIA logs. Different agencies publish logs of requests, what was ultimately produced in response to the request. All of these things can give you a sense of what tends to work and what doesn't. But above all, I would just say experiment. When I started out as a young FOIA warrior, I just sent out a whole bunch of these, and that taught me a hell of a lot about just how this sort of thing works, because you can learn it in the abstract all you want, but nothing is going to come close to just trying it and seeing what happens. In many cases, it doesn't cost anything, or the fees are nominal. just go out there and try it, I think.
All right, and the next question comes from Melody, who asks, have you faced retribution, fear tactics, or other consequences as a result of your reporting?
If you count like, rude text messages, yes, I've gotten death threats, that kind of thing. But I mean, this is nothing like what reporters in countless, authoritarian states face. If you could just go down to Mexico, reporters are, routinely murdered for trying to hold public officials or, narco traffickers and things like that to account. So I don't take very seriously the, inconvenience. Yes, I'll get people that harass me, things like that. It's hard for me to take that very seriously, knowing, the sorts of things that foreign reporters have to face. So it's not nothing. And, I suppose there's a gender component to it too. As a man, it's probably, I'm sure I get less, creepy things than women reporters may get, but it generally is not something. I think you get a lot of keyboard kind of tough guys that it doesn't really necessarily materialize into anything. So again, it's not nothing, but it's not the kind of thing that keeps me up at night.
The next question is from Beth, who asks, have you had any FOIA requests that substantiated any of your stories or the leaked documents within the stories?
Absolutely, yeah. There was one where I don't know why some person was saying this document couldn't be real. They wouldn't do ICE wouldn't do that. So I FOIA'd it, and then I ended up getting the same document back, and I posted it, and I said, well, here it is under FOIA. It's not just a leak, so it's real. And sort of funny because then the guy saw it, and he's like, well, you made up the FOIA too. So sometimes you can't win. But yes, I have used it to substantiate things. They're leaked to me, because when you get a leaked document, you know exactly what it's called, and that's something I stress above all, is knowing the sort of nomenclature around the documents that you're seeking. Because if you can either have a sort of ID code for the document or specifics about where it's located, who it was sent, what it is, that's going to yield the best results. And so that's been my experience. But yeah, when you get a leaked document, you have really specific information there about what you want, and it's quite easy to follow it up with a formal FOIA request to try to substantiate.
Our next question is from Anonymous. How is that lawsuit against Elon Musk in which you are cited going?
I actually don't know. I haven't looked into that. That was an ongoing lawsuit. I don't think that I wasn't the origins of it. I think his yelling at me was used as a sort of exhibit in it, evidence that he has an unfriendly relationship with reporters, which I don't think is untrue. But I haven't looked at that. I don't know where it's at.
Okay, on to the next question. Robbie asks, who's the worst blue check account on Twitter?
I mean, we were just talking about Musk. I don't know if he's the worst, but he's definitely up there. The cringy, memes, the just bad politics. For instance, he said that COVID would be down to like almost 0 cases in April. I think he said that, and he said that children are immune to it. For someone that, postures as a kind of science enthusiast, I think that's pretty crazy for him to say, and it's still up there. He never deleted those tweets. But that's more on aesthetic grounds rather than moral grounds necessarily.
All right, and I think for the sake of time, this will be our last question coming from the audience, though there was a great response, so a lot of people were interested in asking them. But our last question comes from Rohan, who asks, what is the best way to use FOIA to investigate sites of animal cruelty and experimentation? How can activists use FOIA to highlight instances of abuse?
So the important thing to understand about FOIA is that it's only for government agencies. And this is a very important distinction, because around private agencies, companies or even nonprofits, there's virtually no presumption of transparency. They operate in near total secrecy. I often joke that it's easier for me to find something out about the FBI or the CIA than it is for me to find out about, the local bank or grocery store, because I can't FOIA a grocery store. It's just not, that's not what the law is. That being said, you should try to find out whatever government agencies are going to have overlap or jurisdiction or any sort of interaction with the kinds of conduct against animals that you're describing. One that comes to mind might be the USDA, and you can look at what sorts of, I don't know, ways that that would overlap with this interest area. And then once you found that, you can find the types of records that tend to be generated relevant to that. And when you find out what those records are called, ask for them. Once you know what they are, you'll get them back. And at the federal level, it's usually free or very cheap. And it can often take a little while, but you'll get what you want eventually, particularly if it's not national security. National security is always worse than others. But yeah, animal cruelty, I think that's a great idea and something that is probably going to elide a lot of the protections against FOIA that places like the CIA or the Defense Department have, because it's not necessarily a national security body.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted them. And thanks so much to Ken again for answering all of these. We really appreciate it. I think now I'm going to pass it back on to Cindy, the president of the forum, just to close up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aparna, and to Ken for a fantastic moderated Q&A as well as audience Q&A. So now we're just going to wrap up the event. And thank you so much again to our speaker tonight. At all of our events, our communications team puts together a custom poster for our speaker, and this event is no different. So here is tonight's poster for you, Ken, which we're presenting to you virtually. Once we get back on campus, we will be printing these out and we will mail you a framed copy, as we do all of our speakers. And a few final things. So thank you to the audience members for coming out to tonight's event. If you have time and are willing and able, please tell us what you thought so we can continue to improve our events in the future. Please like us on Facebook to stay posted on all of our upcoming events and visit our website if you would like to learn more. We're also currently recruiting and our application to join this organization is due tonight. So if that is of interest to you, please visit our website as well for more info on that. And next week, we have two fantastic events coming up. On Wednesday, we will be hosting Eileen Shu, a YouTube content creator. And then on Thursday, we'll be hosting Joanna Kahlo and Caroline Williams, who will be speaking on their experiences. And finally, if you're willing and able again to help us keep all of our events free, please consider donating to the Berkeley Forum. And thank you all so much again for coming to tonight's edition of the Berkeley Forum, and we hope to see you at an event soon.